As I was preparing, I was remembering a book that I read when I was in university that's called The Handmaid's Tale, written by Margaret Atwood, who's a Canadian author. And the story it's very much a dystopian type of novel that looks at time in the future. This is written in the 1970s, actually. And it's a time where a very male hierarchical with some Christian symbolism type of takeover of the United States happens. And they set up a new alternative government called the Republic of Gilead, where there is tremendous oppression and suppression of women as part of this republic. And an interesting thing that happens, there's many different ways that they're repressed, but they decide that one of the most important repressions on women that can happen is that they're reduced to an oral language. Women, it's against the law for women to read or to write. There's just a small segment of women called the ants who are very much in collusion with the men who are in leadership in the country, where they, for propaganda purposes and and brainwashing purposes, are allowed to read a little bit. But most women are not allowed to read or to write at all. As I was thinking about this, I thought, wow, this fits very well into what I wanted to talk about. And unbelievably to me, because it's 40 years later, this is a popular, hugely popular, I found out, television series now on Hulu. And I was thinking, of all the timing in the world, well, then I thought, the rise of rightist populist politics all around the world, together with the Me Too movement, has brought these things together so that this book is actually very, very timely in the situation that we're in right now. Now, if you ever have a chance to read it, I don't know about how the TV show is. It's popular, but I've never seen it. I don't know how it is. But certainly, I'm sure it's got to be very dark. I'm sure it's very dark. But if you think about what we've been talking about today, and you combine it with this book, it's amazing. The different imageries we've talked about today fit very much into this book, because what happens in The Handmaid's Tale, she actually is taking the role of Hagar in this book. Because there has been worldwide catastrophes, so that there is rampant infertility around the world, and so they are on a hunt to find the few fertile women left. They become the handmaids, and actually they end up being the servants of couples that are actually married, and where you have sorry for the graphic imagery, but the handmaid lying in the official wife's arms while the husband attempts to pregnate her, trying to get a child. There's a lot of Hagar imagery and even FGM imagery in some ways, because this group of women called the ants are doing some of the major oppression of the women actually in this book. So, but I was mainly caught up by what makes oral culture seem like such a suppression, actually, that she wanted to include it in this book. Now, it's, I suppose, logical that a highly literate author is going to consider oral culture a punishment in some ways. But then as I began thinking about that, is that really true in today's society? So as we look at orality, now orality has really become a buzzword in missiology, actually. I'm speaking more as a missiologist here than as any other kind of researcher. But particularly with Lausanne, time of world evangelization, the conference that came out of that started the International Orality Network, and people are discovering orality as if nobody had really ever thought of it before. So it's quite the buzzword nowadays. Now, so there's a lot of research coming out about it, which has been very helpful. And for all of you people who've been involved in literacy, great news is that actually primary oral learners are decreasing. And by primary oral learners are the people who, out of necessity, have to be oral learners. It's people generally who don't read and write at all. And that isn't always rural people. Actually, there's an increase of primary oral learners in urban settings. Actually, in very dense urban settings, sometimes there's an increase in oral learners because of either economic reasons that they don't go to school long enough, but they are actually worldwide decreasing. However, Secondary oral learners are significantly increasing. And the definition, Walter Ong, who's a specialist, he's passed away now, but he certainly was the one that coined the term orality, and has done probably the most serious academic writing on it. He defines it as people who can read and write, but actually out of preference, they choose not to read and write, and that is not the primary way they take in the information. Now we can think, yeah, we all live in cultures that they might have gone to school up to grade 3 or 4. We know they can read and write and they don't prefer it. But this is far wider than that. And so I looked at some studies by a professor named Jay Moon. He's now at Asbury Seminary, but when he was doing his studies, he was at a different seminary. Over 9 years, he traced seminary students. Now, if you think about seminary students, they'd be people who would be generally pretty literate. You know, they've gone through at least 16 years of schooling, and in seminary, they're obviously very adept at reading and writing. And he traced, through a literary tool that he had, over 9 years, the percentage of oral preference learners he had as seminary students. And in those 9 years, it went from 42% to 73% oral preference learners. And that's among seminary students. So if that's true among seminary students, if you think about preference of people worldwide, that's going to make a difference. Now, I had some interesting... It went from 42 to 72, yeah, 47 to 72. Now, I had some correspondence with him over the last few weeks because I wanted to ask him, because he never made any reference to gender in any of his studies. So I said to him, obviously you had so few women in your seminary classes, obviously you didn't feel you needed to mention that. He said, well, actually I had about 40% women in my classes. And I said, oh, and you didn't think about maybe checking that out? Wouldn't have taken a lot of time? He said, actually, I didn't. So, but I'm still guessing that probably that very similar percentages for them. And certainly worldwide, when you look at UNESCO statistics about oral learners worldwide, it's well over 60 to 70%, with a high percentage being of women in that. Now, out of then what has happened with the orality statistics and all the emphasis on orality, the International Orality Network, it has gone just automatically after that into storytelling as a key tool in the missiological toolkit, so to speak. Now, it's gone very limited in some ways into storytelling, as if just telling a verbal story is the main way of communicating. But as you look more into storytelling, rather than just, I will now tell you a story rather than, read you a list of things, what is it about storytelling that is actually important? And to try to break down that a bit. Well, I've been looking at it in terms of just narrative in general, and really much of our identity construction as individuals, and I don't mean as Christians even, but just as who we are, either in our cultures, in our nationalities, in our families, it's constructed narratively. It's constructed through story. Our families tell us who we are. We have historical moments in our families. We have historical moments in our countries, in our football teams. Many things that we're interested, the things that make us make who we are happen, comes through a narrative type of construction. And Jesus also teaches us who our new identity is narratively. I was just looking at this beautiful picture that I found of Mary and the perfume and Jesus's feet. I'm very much, Jesus teaches me by art in a lot of ways. I can't draw, but I certainly appreciate art. And I was thinking about all the different stories. Now, there's lots of, in fact, it's funny. I probably looked at 25 books trying to get a good statistic on what percentage of the Bible is narrative. And most of it was between 55 and 75%. So there's lots and lots of stories in the Bible. And I was thinking about all the different ways Jesus tells us the parables again and again, often similar ones to reinforce. On the Emmaus Road, he's walking with them, explaining everything through the scriptures by story, everything that they think they've got it, but they still are missing it. He's telling them by story. You see, Paul does it. Paul, even though he's very propositional in a lot of his presentations throughout the Pauline epistles, still he's telling stories throughout the book of Acts. So it's an important part of telling us who we are. Now, there was a very famous woman storyteller. You may have heard of her. Her name is SharedStories. Now, some people say she was real, some people say she wasn't real, and certainly Muslim writers on her certainly vary very much between completely spurious, nothing to do with Islam whatsoever, but there's some very thoughtful books about saying no, that this tale of 1,001 Nights actually does reveal a lot of positive things about Islam. So it was a Persian king, actually, Shahryar. He'd been betrayed by his wife, and so his punishment, not just of her, but the way he decided to live after that is he married a new virgin every day, and he had her murdered the next day. And that way he could absolutely be confident that his wife would never be cheating on him again. Now, Scheherazade was a lovely young girl from his kingdom, and she was very well read. She had supposedly owned thousands of books on history and philosophy, the arts and the sciences, and she volunteered to go to the king one night and to be the virgin that he married that night. But she worked with her sister first and asked that her sister would visit her in the middle of the night. So her sister came and she said, "Excuse me, king, my sister has come to visit me. I need to visit with her a bit." Gave permission. And she began to tell her a story. Scheherazade told her sister the story. And then as it was about to end at a very exciting point, she said, "Oh, it's dawn. You have to leave now. Goodbye." And the king who had been listening, but what about the end of the story? "I'm sorry, it's dawn." So he let her live another day because he wanted to hear the end of the story, and she started another story. And so the fable goes on that this is why 1,001 Nights. She told a story up until the end, and without finishing it, by this point the king had fallen in love with her, decided to marry her, and not kill her in the morning. So this was one of our famous women storytellers in Islam. But there's in Longing to Call Them Sisters, I say this was the most profound thing that I read on this topic, because I was thinking, do we just go, those of us who, I'm not very oral, I think I'm very literate in a lot of ways, do I just start telling stories and then everything will be fine after that when I'm working with oral preference people? And in Annette Hall in Longing to Call Them Sisters, she's got some excellent examples of the mistakes that we have made as literate people trying to make a move over to orality, where we've tried to tell stories, but we've told them too long, we've told them too fast. In real oral cultures, they take things slowly. They repeat things more than once. She pulled up some examples of films done from Central Africa where a story was told, it was dramatized, then they told it again another way, and then they told it again a third time. She said for her it went too slow, but in an oral culture where they're memorizing things as they watch it, it has to be done in a different way. So that's something that I thought was very good to learn from her book. So the speed, lack of repetition, and also the lack of the creative arts. And this has been one of the things that's been missing when, as practitioners, we have identified that, yes, orality is an important thing, and we have tried to go into storytelling and looked at orality too narrowly as just telling a verbal story. The whole orality network and the whole orality approach is much wider than that. It doesn't include just a verbal story. It includes use of the visual arts, includes use of drama, puppets, dance, and music. Now, we're going to go into some case studies that I want to talk about that's based on a ministry in Istanbul that's called TACO. And TACO had noticed, the group of people that are part of this team, had noticed the incredible affinity that Muslims, Turkish Muslims at least, had about Christmas. Now, they assumed at first this was just sort of a resonance, the secularized Muslims in Turkey had a resonance with the West and, warm, fuzzy Christmas movies and all that. But they were fascinated to notice that in churches in Turkey during Christmas time, many, many serious Muslims were also there as well. Very interested in the story, very interested in taking away the materials they were given at the end, enjoying the Christmas carols. And so they decided that actually Christian holidays seemed to be an interesting thing for Muslims in Turkey. So they prepared an Easter presentation of Jesus' death and resurrection and invited lots of people. And it was a complete and utter flop. People were cold, they were hostile, they either didn't come at all. And so the team went back and thought, what is the difference between Christmas and Easter when it comes to this kind of presentation? And as they thought, as they prayed about it, as they discussed, as they asked people, they realized that it was really the shared stories in the Bible and the Quran that made the difference. We all know that the Christmas story in the Quran is actually quite similar to the Christmas story that we have in the Bible. But there is no Easter story in the Quran, and so they decided that that's what was missing. Now, there's a fantastic book, if anybody's actually interested in this topic, because I don't have time to much talk about it, but there's a book by Robert Gregg called SharedStories, Rival Tellings. Now, there's 27 stories total that are the same between the Bible and the Quran. He takes 5 of them, and he goes through the complete, not just the telling, but the worldview of how Christians, Jews, and Muslims all approach these stories, because most of what we have, actually, Jews have as well. Women are involved in half of them, though they don't necessarily have a speaking role. Now, so after Taco Desai had the flop, one of the members of the leadership team went to London and was just happened to be there, and he went to something that was called a medieval cycle play that actually dates back to the 5th century. And they used it for about up to the 11th century as a way to actually educate believers, because in those days believers were illiterate. So they used these medieval cycle plays as a way to, using music and dance and theatrics to tell biblical stories. And so one of the leaders of the team thought, we need to do this, but we need to actually relate it more to the shared stories that are in the Bible and the Quran. So the first story they took is the story of Abraham. Now, they wanted also to have an angle that reached women in a particular way. Obviously, we've all seen Abraham's story used in many different ways in an Islamic context. But they had never seen ever the angle of Sarah's childlessness being really featured. Now, in Turkey, as in most of the Muslim world, infertility is one of the biggest shames that a woman has, and it's one of the biggest pains that a family carries. And so they wrote a play that involved music, it involved dance, it involved puppets, and all the music was written in Turkish style, very much Turkish style, telling the story of Abraham and Sarah's childlessness. And eventually they get, obviously, their son. They were very clever. They never actually called the son anything but Abraham's son at this point. But and then eventually he gets the child, and in the end they do declare that Jesus is the final sacrifice. But most of the angle is really Sarah's childlessness through this. It was incredibly popular. They've probably had, I think they've had 75 different performances of this, and every time there's dozens, if not hundreds, of Muslims watching the performance and clapping enthusiastically with great joy when they get their child. So it was wonderful. I'm down to 5. Is that it? Okay. 2, oh no! I can't tell you the next one then, because there's 2 case studies. I can't tell you it all because I have to show you the video. So after the second sort of tour around the country they did of this, they made a video that I'd like you to see.
We had a pretty daunting task in front of us. How are we going to get the gospel out into parks and crowded areas of pretty unfamiliar territory in central and southern Turkey? We thought it might be a little bit more difficult this time because of the turbulent political situation and demonstrations on the streets. Would the people misunderstand what we were trying to communicate? And how would the police respond? But with lots of prayer and a team of 12 crazy friends, we headed out on our 15-day journey, stepping out in faith with a sort of stomach-turning feeling of nervousness, excitement, and anticipation. Like Paul said, thanks be to God who always leads us on in triumphal procession in Christ, and through us spreads everywhere the fragrance of the knowledge of Him. When we look at the speeches in the book of Acts, we see how the disciples were able to hold audiences of very skeptical or even hostile people by going through a very sincere and in-depth review of the people's history and stories. At the end, they were always able to present Christ as the climax and culmination of all things and set Him up like a shining crown on top of all this precious history. We tried to do a similar thing by approaching people respectfully and using totally Turkish music and telling the story of Abraham using puppets, dancing, narration, and folk music. People watched intently as they saw the story unfold, and they clapped for joy as Abraham and Sarah finally received their child. They waited with bated breath as Abraham laid his child on the altar, and they rejoiced as Isaac was untied, set free from the altar, and the family was reunited, praising God. At the end of our story, the puppet narrator asked, "What about our story? Does the God who loved and cared for Abraham and Sarah also love and care for us? We all know that God sent a sacrifice to save Abraham's son, but could he send a sacrifice to save me, to save you? Well, he could, and he did. And he sent Jesus as the true and final sacrifice. And with this, he saves us and brings us into his kingdom." It was always a joy to watch people's reaction to this surprising news, and it was always a joy to watch him work wherever we went. The first place we stopped, we weren't actually able to do our theater performance because the police didn't give us permission, so we just tried to play some music and talk to people and find whoever we could in the park. People were very friendly, and even amongst packs of rowdy small-town youth that we just met, God gave us great opportunities to preach the good news. And as we were leaving late that night, a bunch of students insisted that we come to their house for breakfast. When we went, we were received like royalty and given a massive feast. There were deliciously fried pastries and some sort of crazy Georgian potato spread that made our mouths explode with joy. We laughed, shared stories, and then they sent us on our way with lots of hugs and kisses. At another place, we didn't have quite such a warm welcome, but we were met with lots of suspicious questioners. One guy from our team was approached by a couple of guys, and a curious but sort of suspicious crowd gathered. Thankfully, God gave him a few wise and gentle words that disarmed the most aggressive questioner, and this changed the whole atmosphere. And right there, as our friend explained the good news in detail, God created a mini gospel lecture hall out of what could have been a fairly hostile crowd. At another point, we saw him transform our schedule, and through some unexpected delays, he put us in exactly the right space at exactly the right time. God worked wonders wherever we went, and it was amazing to watch him turn ordinary parks and waterfronts into open-air theaters, filled with the news of his love and truth, radiating out to everyone within range. We got to see droves full of people run right into an encounter with the gospel, and we saw his words of truth seep through conversations into some very dark, dry, and forgotten cracks. We could never ever have done any of this with our own planning or made this happen with our own strength, but we're so thankful that we got to watch him do it. He's always ready to take ordinary people and create amazing opportunities, to shine his light into darkness and to establish faith in him where none believe. And what a privilege it is to walk with him hand in hand into the unknown.